The parchment shook in the elder's hand, not from wind. There was no wind in that hall, but from something closer to shame trying to pass itself off as cold. Eilis counted the shake 3 times. She had learned to count things instead of feeling them. It was cheaper. "Read it," said Varric. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. The Alpha King of the Ashwood Crown stood half a head above every man in that hall and still managed to make the room feel smaller around him, the way a held breath makes a chest feel smaller. His eyes were the gray of river ice in the thaw. Not blue, not silver, a gray that had its own name in the old tongue and no equivalent in this one. That was his detail, the one thing on him that belonged to no one else. Eyes that changed shade with his mood, the only outward door into a man who otherwise gave nothing away. The elder read. For the debt incurred in the matter of the southern grain theft, 60 years unpaid, the Pack of Hollowmere offers one daughter, Eilis, unmarried, no claim, no mate bond, in full settlement. Stop. Varric's hand came up. Not far, an inch, the hall stopped with it. Eilis stood at the center of the floor in a dress that did not belong to her, borrowed that morning from a woman who would not meet her eyes, and she made herself breathe through her mouth so the room's scent. Wood smoke, wet stone, the metal tang of 40 wolves, trying not to shift, would not crawl down her throat and choke her. She had one detail too, though she didn't know yet that he had already catalogued it. A thin white scar through her left eyebrow, shaped like a fishhook, from a fall on ice when she was 9. It made her look, when she frowned, like she was perpetually asking a question. She was asking one now, just not out loud. Why me? Varric took the parchment from the elder's shaking hand. He did not tear it yet. First he read it himself, silently, his eyes moving once, twice, a third time over the same line near the bottom. And something crossed his face that Eilis would spend the next 4 acts of her life trying to name. Not anger. Not yet. Calculation wearing anger's coat. This says her father agreed. He did, my lord. Her father is dead 3 years. The elder did not answer that. Beside him, a younger man, broad through the shoulders, a notch missing from his left ear like a wolf had taken a bite of him once, and decided he wasn't worth finishing. Shifted his weight and looked at the floor. His name was Reskin. He would matter later, for now he was only a man who could not hold a king's gaze. Who signed in his place, Varric said. Silence answered him. Who? He said again, softer, which was worse. The Pack Council, my lord, as is custom when the debtor's line has lapsed. She is the debtor's line. She is the payment, my lord, not the. She is standing in front of me with a pulse I can hear from here, Varric said. And you are telling me she is property because the men who owed the debt found it convenient to die before they paid it. Nobody in that hall breathed for a count of 4. Eilis included. She had come here expecting to be sold like grain, like cattle, like the 60-year-old theft she'd had nothing to do with and barely understood, and instead the man buying her was arguing with her sellers on her behalf, and she did not know which fear was larger, the fear of being taken, or the strange new fear of being refused. Varric looked at her then, properly, the first time all morning. Did you sign anything? He asked her directly, which no one had done. No, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt it deserved to. No one asked me. No, he agreed, like she'd confirmed something he already suspected. They didn't, and he tore the contract in half. The sound of it was small. Paper doesn't scream. But 40 wolves heard it like a gunshot, and Eilis felt the tear travel up through her own sternum, a crack opening in a wall she hadn't known she was leaning on. This pack's debt is not paid, Varric said to the hall, not to her. It is forgiven, on the condition that the woman it tried to spend is never again offered as currency in my territory. She is not a settlement. She is not a balance struck. The next person who writes her name on a ledger answers to me. Personally, and I promise you all, I read ledgers very, very closely. He let the 2 halves of the parchment fall to the stone floor. Then he turned and walked out, and took no woman with him. That was the part the pack of Hollowmere had not prepared for. They had built the morning around a transaction, a debt closed, a daughter gone, a problem solved in one clean motion, the way you solve a leak, by routing the water somewhere else. Instead, the king had named the wound and left the daughter standing inside it, alive, unclaimed, and now visibly, publicly, a thing the pack had tried to throw away in front of the one man strong enough to remember it. Eilis understood by the second hour after he'd gone that she had been given a freedom with no shelter built around it. The elders did not look at her in the corridors. That was its own kind of answer. Riskin, the one with the bitten ear, found her by the well at dusk, and for a moment she thought he meant her, some small kindness, water, bread, an apology dressed as practicality. "You should have gone with him," he said instead. "He didn't take me. That's worse." Reskin's jaw worked. "You think this is over because he tore a piece of paper? Paper wasn't the problem, Eilis. You were the solution. Now you're just the problem again, and you're still here. Say what you mean." He almost did. She watched him get right up to the edge of it. His mouth opened, his eyes flicked toward the elder's hall, the muscles under his bitten ear ticked once, and then he swallowed it back down like a man choking on a fishbone he'd decided to keep. "Lock your door," he said, and left her at the well, with the water going cold in the bucket and her own pulse loud in her ears. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark, counting the gaps between footsteps in the hall outside her room, and on the 11th gap she heard, very clearly, a woman's voice, Marin, the dyer, who never raised her voice for anything, say one sentence through a wall not built to hold sound. She still doesn't know it was never about the grain. Eilis sat up in the dark. It was the first thread. She didn't know yet it would unravel everything. He came back 3 days later. Not for her, or so he said, standing in the doorway of the small room Hollowmere had given her, at the edge of the packlands, the room with the thinnest walls and the draftiest window, the room you give someone you've decided to forget about slowly instead of all at once. "I came to inspect the border markers," Varric said. "Yours fell down in the storm." "I don't have a border marker, my lord. I have a window that doesn't close." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost a smile leaves behind when it decides not to commit. "Then I came to inspect the window." He did not come in. He stood in the doorway with one shoulder against the frame, close enough that she could smell him under the wood smoke and wet wool of 3 days' ride. Cedar and something darker underneath it. Iron bright, the smell wolves got when they hadn't shifted in too long, and the wolf was pacing under the skin asking to be let out. She had never been close enough to a king to know that kings smelled like anything at all. It unsettled her more than his eyes did. "Why did you tear it?" she asked. She had been holding the question for 3 days like a stone in her shoe. "Because it was a bad contract. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you tonight." But he didn't leave. He looked past her into the small bare room, at the bed with one blanket and the window with no glass, and something in his jaw tightened the way a man's jaw tightens when he's doing arithmetic he doesn't like the sum of. "They're not feeding you. They're feeding me. They're feeding you, enough not to be accused of anything. That's not the same." She didn't answer that because it was true and she hadn't wanted it said out loud. "I have men at the border," he said. 2 of them. They'll watch the road, not the pack. I have no claim to send men inside another alpha's walls without cause. You understand the difference? I understand you can watch the door, but not the room." Yes. His eyes had gone the color of river ice cracking, that gray-going pale shade she would later learn meant he was angrier than he let his voice show. "I'm sorry it's not more than that." It was the first time anyone in 3 days had apologized to her for anything, and it landed somewhere under her ribs harder than the tearing of the contract had. "Why does it matter to you?" she said. "What happens to me? You don't know me." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. I read the ledger before I tore it, he said finally. 60 years, Eilis. 60 years, and no one in Hollowmere paid a single coin of that debt until the year your father died and you turned 17. That's not a coincidence. That's a calendar. He pushed off the doorframe. I don't know what you saw. But I know what a debt looks like when it's real, and I know what one looks like when someone built it on purpose to be rid of a problem. Yours was the second kind. He left before she could ask the question that the sentence had cracked open in her chest like an egg. Rid of a problem. What problem? What did I see? She didn't sleep that night either. But it was a different kind of not sleeping. The first kind had been fear. This kind had a shape to it, almost like hope, and that frightened her more than the fear had, because hope was the kind of thing this pack had taught her to distrust on sight. The questions stacked up faster than answers came. She started watching the elders the way they'd been avoiding watching her. Old Cabot, with his missing fourth finger, lost in a hunt decades back, who would not say her name without clearing his throat first, as if her name were a stone caught there. Marin the dyer, blue-stained to the wrist, who brought her bread some mornings, and would not meet her eyes while she did it. The kindness and the guilt arriving in the same hand. And Reskin, who watched the road more than he watched her, like he was waiting for something to come up it. She pressed Marin first, because Marin's guilt felt like the softest door. What did I see? Eilis said low, in the dying shed where the air was thick with woad and onion skin, and no one else came unless they had to. 3 nights ago, through my wall. You said it was never about the grain. Marin's hands stopped moving in the dye vat. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of blue water. I said nothing, Marin said, and you heard nothing. Eilis, please, for your own sake, let the king's kindness be enough and don't go digging under it. Some ground holds nothing but bones. Whose bones? Marin looked at her then, really looked, the kind of look that costs something to give. And for 1 second Eilis saw not guilt but grief, old and pressed flat like a flower in a book. You were 11, Marin said, so quiet it barely qualified as sound. You won't remember it the way it happened. Children don't. They remember the wrong details and the right fear. She turned back to her vat. Go home, Eilis. Lock your door. That's the whole of my advice and more than I should have given. It was not nothing. It was a door with a shape behind it, even if the door wouldn't open yet. That night Reskin came again. Later, the moon higher, his bitten ear catching what little light there was. You've been asking Marin things, he said. Not a question. You said I should leave. Now you're checking on me. Which is it, Reskin? Both. He scrubbed a hand over his face. I was 12 when it happened. I remember pieces. Pieces aren't enough to hang anyone, and if you go looking for the rest of it before you understand what you're looking for, you'll get the elders' attention in a way you don't want. What happened, Reskin? He looked at her, really looked, the way a man looks at someone he's about to fail, and already knows it, and said, Ask me again when the king's back. I'll tell it in front of him or not at all. I don't trust myself to say it to just you, where it disappears if I'm wrong about who's listening at the wall. It was a strange kind of promise. She held on to it anyway, because it was the only one anyone had offered her with both hands instead of half a one. Varric's men at the border watched the road exactly as he'd said. 2 wolves in human shape, unsmiling. Polite, utterly useless against anything that came from inside the walls rather than along the road. Eilis understood this within 4 days. The pack of Hollowmere understood it within 3. The campaign against her did not look like violence. It looked like erasure. Her water bucket went missing and was found cracked. The borrowed dress she'd worn to the hall, the only good dress she owned now, since none of her own clothes had survived the move to the edge room, vanished from the line and reappeared 2 days later, torn at the seam, with an apology so thin it barely covered the insult underneath it. Someone began a rumor, low and slow, the kind that doesn't need a source, because it spreads through agreement instead of evidence, that the king hadn't refused her out of mercy, that he'd looked at her and found her not worth the cost of feeding. It worked on her exactly as well as it was built to. She started believing pieces of it at 3 a.m, when the wind found the gap in her window, and the cold made every doubt sound more convincing. She was wrong to believe it, and she knew she was wrong, and she believed it anyway for 1 whole week, which was, in its own quiet way, the first thing the story cost her. Not a wolf, not a wound, just a week of believing herself unwanted, when the truth was colder and more dangerous than that. She was wanted by exactly the wrong people, for exactly the wrong reason, and not wanted at all by the only person whose unwanting would have actually been safe for her. Varric returned on the 8th day and found her thinner, and said nothing about it, which she appreciated more than if he'd said everything. "Reskin wants to speak," he told her instead, standing again in that doorway that had become its own small ritual. "In front of me. He asked for it. He asked me to wait for you before he'd say anything. Then let's not make him wait longer." Something flickered through Varric's face, not quite a smile, closer to relief wearing the shape of patience. "I don't like men who only tell truth to power. But I like them better than men who tell it to no one." They found Reskin at the well, where everything in this story seemed to happen, as if the well itself were keeping count. "Say it," Varric said, not unkindly, just the same flat command he'd used on the elder in the hall, the one that made rooms shrink. Reskin's throat worked. His bitten ear, in the lamplight, looked almost raw, like the old wound had never quite finished healing. 11 years ago, he said, there was a hunt gone wrong on the eastern ridge. A boy died. Mikkel, the smith's son. The pack story was a rockfall. He looked at Eilis. "You were there, gathering kindling, you and 3 other children, near enough to see it and far enough to not be noticed seeing it. You told your father what you saw. He believed you." "What did I see?" Eilis said. Her voice had gone very small. "Reskin, what did I see?" "It wasn't a rockfall," Reskin said. Cabot pushed him. The well seemed to drop 10 degrees colder. "Mikkel had found something," Reskin went on, faster now, like a man who'd carried a stone uphill, so long the only relief left was letting it roll. "Records. Old ones, about a grain shipment the council skimmed from 60 years back. The same shipment your contract names, Eilis. The original, debt, except it was never owed to anyone outside Hollowmere. The council stole from its own stores and blamed an outside debt to cover the gap, and McCall found the actual ledger, and Cabot put him off the ridge before he could show anyone. The original assumption, the one the viewer, and Eilis, had carried since the cold open, that the debt was old and real, and she was simply unlucky collateral in an honest ledger, cracked clean in half, the same sound the contract had made in the king's hands. "Your father believed you," Reskin said again, softer now. "He went to Cabot, quietly, he thought. He died 8 months later. Fever, they said. No one asked why a healthy man caught a fever that fast. He swallowed twice, and didn't try to dress it up as anything but what it was. The debt to the king's pack wasn't 60 years old, Eilis. It was invented 3 years ago, after your father died, when the elders realized you were the only living person who'd ever told the truth about that ridge, and old enough now that selling a grown woman to settle a blood debt looked like custom instead of what it actually was. Which was what, Varric said. Quiet. Lethal in its quietness. Getting rid of the last witness, Reskin said, without anyone having to push her off anything themselves. Eilis stood very still at the well, the bucket forgotten at her feet, and felt the whole shape of the last 3 years rearrange itself around a center that had been hidden the entire time. She had thought she was unwanted. She had been, this whole time, too dangerous to keep, which was its own kind of being wanted, the worst kind, the kind that gets you sold instead of held. Varric's eyes had gone the pale, cracked gray she'd learned to read as fury held very still. "They didn't try to settle a debt," he said. "They tried to launder a murder through my contract. You couldn't have known, Ilis said, and hated instantly that some old loyal piece of her had reached for his comfort before her own. I should have read it twice before I tore it, Varric said. Tearing it felt like justice. It let them keep their secret a week longer while I rode home satisfied with myself. His jaw tightened. That's on me, not you. It was the disappointing thing he was owed. Not cruelty, not betrayal. Just the ordinary human failure of a man who'd solved the visible problem and missed the one hiding under it. And it cost Ilis something to hear him admit it plainly, instead of explaining it away. She had not expected a king to be capable of saying, "That's on me." She filed it next to the apology in the doorway, in the small growing ledger of things about him that didn't match what kings were supposed to be. Cabot moved that same night, which told its own story about how long he'd been waiting for Reskin to break. Ilis woke to her door already open. Not broken. Open, which was worse. Because it meant someone had a key, or someone inside had given one up, and a shape in the dark that smelled of wood smoke and the particular sourness of a man who hadn't bathed in fear for 2 days. She didn't scream. She had learned, somewhere in the last 3 years, that screaming wasted the breath you needed for running. She ran, bare feet on frozen ground, lungs burning, the dark hedge line scratching her arms, and behind her, the sound she would remember longest, not shouting, not pursuit, but a single low whistle, the kind Hollowmere used to call wolves to a hunt, and the understanding that landed in her chest like a dropped stone. This was planned. This was not panic. This was a clean removal, finally, the kind they should have arranged 3 years ago, instead of writing a contract. She made it as far as the border marker. Fallen again. Still, no one had fixed it before a hand closed on her arm. Not Cabot's. Reskin's. "This way," he said, already pulling her off the road, toward the 2 bored wolves Varric had posted there, who came instantly alert the moment they smelled her fear. "Get her to the king now. I'll buy you the time. Reskin, I let a boy die 11 years ago by staying quiet," he said, and his voice cracked on the word quiet in a way that told her exactly how long he'd practiced not letting it crack. "I'm not doing that twice." He turned back toward the dark, toward Cabot's whistle. Toward whatever it cost him, and Ilis was hauled onto a horse she didn't remember mounting, and the last she saw of Hollowmere that night was Reskin's silhouette, standing in the road with his shoulders set like a man bracing for a blow he'd decided to take on purpose. Varric met them at his own gate before the horse had fully stopped, which meant someone had run ahead, which meant... She understood later. He had not been asleep at all, had in fact been awake every night since the well, waiting for exactly this. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He looked the way you look at something you've already decided matters more than the conversation about it. And then he said, low, to the man who'd ridden in with her, "Cabbot, tonight, in my territory or theirs?" "Theirs, my lord. He sent men across the borderline near the eastern ridge. Then he just gave me cause." Something settled into Varric's face that Ilis hadn't seen there before. Not fury this time. Fury had already passed through and left this colder thing behind it, a decision with the heat boiled off. "Bring the council of Hollowmere here, all of them. Tonight, not at dawn. And someone find me the boy named Mikol's mother if she's still living. I want her in the hall when I say what I'm about to say." He turned to Ilis last. "You don't have to be there," he said. "I won't make you stand in another hall while old men decide what you're worth. I want to be there." Her voice didn't shake, which surprised her more than anything else that night had. "I've spent 3 years being talked about in rooms I wasn't allowed in. I'm done with that part." Something crossed his face. Not quite pride. Closer to recognition, like he'd been waiting to hear exactly that sentence from her and hadn't known how badly until it arrived. "Then stand where I can see you," he said, "not behind me." Beside. It was the smallest thing. It was the line crossed. Not a kiss, not a vow. A king telling a woman where to stand in a hall of judgment, beside instead of behind. and she felt it land in her chest harder than any touch had managed in 3 years of careful distance. The hall filled fast. Cabot arrived under guard. His missing fourth finger curled uselessly at his side, as if it too were trying to disappear. Marin came, blue to the wrist even at this hour, and would not look at Cabot at all. An old woman Eilis didn't recognize was helped to a bench near the front, small, gray, with a burn scar across the back of one hand that marked her, even from across the room, as someone who'd spent a lifetime near a forge. McColl's mother. She had waited 11 years for this room to exist. Varric did not sit. He held the torn halves of the original contract. He had kept them, she realized, both pieces, in a fold of his coat, as if some part of him had known they weren't finished doing their work. "I tore this," he said, holding the halves up where the whole hall could see, "because I believed it was a man-made injustice, a pack solving an old debt by spending a person it had decided not to value. I was wrong about the size of what I was tearing." He let that sit a beat. It wasn't a debt contract. It was a murder weapon with 60 years of paperwork wrapped around it to make it look like custom. The hall did not gasp. It went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when it has half suspected something for years and is finally being told it's allowed to know it. "Cabbot," Varric said. 11 years ago you put a boy off a ridge because he'd found proof your council stole from its own granaries, and blamed a debt that never existed. Eilis saw it. Her father believed her and died for it, and when she came of an age to be useful as currency, you built a contract to be rid of the only living witness, and you dressed it up as honoring an old obligation, and you sold it to me as custom." "My lord, this is," Cabot started. "I'm not finished." Varric's voice did not rise. It never had to. "I tore that contract because no person is a settlement for someone else's ledger. I'm tearing the rest of you apart tonight for a different reason. You killed a boy and let a girl carry the weight of it alone for 11 years. And then you tried to finish what you started 3 nights ago, on my border, with my men watching the wrong side of the line because I trusted you to police your own house." His eyes found Cabot and did not let go. "I won't trust it again." Cabot's jaw worked. For one moment, the humanizing beat the night seemed to owe him, the one true breath of something other than calculation. His composure broke entirely, and what came through wasn't menace but something smaller and sadder. "I was 20 when I took that grain," he said, hoarse. "We were starving that winter, all of us, and I thought I'd fixed it quietly and no one would ever." He stopped, looked at his own ruined hand. "It was never meant to cost a boy's life. And then it did, and I couldn't undo that without losing everything. So I kept choosing the smaller crime to cover the larger one, every year, until there was nothing left of me but the covering." It was true, and it was not an excuse, and Varric did not treat it as one. "That's the version where you're the only person who suffered for your choices," Varric said. "McColl's mother has been sitting on that bench for 11 years waiting for someone to say his name out loud in a room with consequences in it. Say it." Cabot's mouth opened, closed. He looked finally at the small gray woman with the burn scar, and something in him gave way entirely. "McColl," he said. "I'm sorry, I am." His voice broke. "There is no version of sorry that's the right size for this. It wasn't forgiveness." No one in that hall offered him any, least of all Eilis, who watched the man who'd ordered her father's silence finally run out of cover and felt, instead of triumph, only a tired ache. The ache of a wound finally being looked at instead of hidden. That was the second open loop closing, not, why did the king refuse the deal? That answer had been arriving in pieces for an hour now, but the planted question from earlier, the one about what it would cost her to finally be believed. The answer was, it cost her nothing further, and that, after 3 years of every truth costing her something, was its own kind of shock. "Hollomir's council is dissolved as of tonight," Varric said. "Cabot answers to McColl's mother and to the laws of this territory in whatever order she chooses. Reskin," his eyes found the younger man, bruised, brought in last. Having been paid for his hour on the road with a split lip and a limp he wasn't favoring on purpose, stays free and stands as witness of record, because a man who finally tells the truth at personal cost is worth more to a pack than 10 who never had to choose. He turned, last, to Eyeless. "You are not on trial here," he said. "You were never on trial. You were never currency, either, no matter how many times this hall tried to make you both." The hall emptied slowly, the way water drains from a basin with too narrow a hole. Cabot taken under guard, the old council scattering to whatever judgment Mikol's mother chose to hand down in the days that followed, Marin weeping quietly into her own blue-stained hands, finally allowed to grieve something out loud instead of through a wall. Reskin caught Eyeless's eye on his way out and gave her a small, exhausted nod, the kind two people give each other when they've survived the same fire from different sides of it. Eyeless stayed. Varric stood with the torn contract still in his hand, looking at it now the way a man looks at a tool he's finished using. "I owe you an apology that isn't shaped like a doorway conversation," he said. "You already gave me one of those. This is a different one." He set the torn halves down on the long table, deliberately, like laying down a weapon. "I tore this to refuse a transaction. That was the easy part. Refusing to buy a person costs a king nothing. It makes him look generous for the price of a piece of paper. The harder thing was staying curious about why the transaction existed at all, instead of riding home satisfied that I'd done the noble thing. I didn't do that part well. You nearly paid for my satisfaction with your life tonight. You came back. I came back because I couldn't stop thinking about a girl standing in a hall, being sold like grain, and asking, with her whole face, why me? And I didn't have a good enough answer, and bad answers have always bothered me more than hard questions." His eyes had gone back to that gray she'd started to think of, privately, as the color of him being honest. "I'm not telling you that to be thanked for it. I'm telling you because I don't want whatever this is between us built on you being grateful I rescued you. I'd rather it be built on nothing at all than on that." It was, she would realize later, the single most romantic sentence anyone had ever said to her, precisely because it refused to sound like one. "What do you want it built on then?" she asked. "I don't know yet." He almost smiled. The real one this time, not the ghost of one. "I've never built one of these without a contract before. I find I don't trust the ones with paper attached anymore." She laughed, surprised herself by laughing. In a hall that an hour ago had held a confession to murder, and the sound seemed to undo something in him, some held line in his shoulders she hadn't noticed until it released. "There's no bond between us," she said. It wasn't a question. She needed to hear it said plainly, by both of them, in a hall built for plain things. No faded mark. No scent pull making either of us feel something we'd talk ourselves out of in daylight. "No," he agreed. "I checked. More than once, if I'm honest, in the kind of way a man checks his own pockets for a coin he's hoping not to find. Because finding it would make this easier and I didn't want it easy. I wanted it true." "Why?" "Because everyone in your life so far has decided your worth for you," Varric said. "Your pack decided you were a debt. A bond would have decided you were a destiny. I didn't want to be one more thing deciding you, Eyeless. I wanted you to have at least one choice left that was entirely, boringly, unmagically yours." The space between them had been closing all night in inches she'd barely tracked. Across a well, across a doorway, across a hall, and now it closed the last of the way, slow, deliberate, the kind of step that gives the other person every chance in the world to step back first. She didn't. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, cedar and wood smoke, and underneath it now something steadier, banked instead of pacing. "Then ask me," she said, properly, like a man with no contract and no bond, and nothing to fall back on but the asking. Eyeless. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it had in the elders shaking hands at the start of this. "Would you choose to stay? Not as anything owed to me, not as anything I'm owed by you. Just stay, And let's find out what we are without a ledger telling either of us the answer. Yes, she said, and did not need a beat to decide it, because for the first time in 3 years no one else's fear or guilt or old debt was standing between her and the answer. Yes, for myself, not for the bond that doesn't exist, and not because you tore up a piece of paper. Because you came back to ask the harder question, twice, even when the easy one would have let you sleep. He kissed her then, not the kind of kiss that announces itself to a hall, brief, restrained, more promise than event, his hand coming up to rest along her jaw with a care that felt, after 3 years of being handled like cargo, almost unbearably gentle, and pulled back before it could become anything the cameras of the wider world, or the gossiping mouths of 2 packs, could turn into spectacle. Some things were not for an audience. This, they both seemed to understand without saying it, was one of them. For the record, he murmured, I'm aware I owe you a window that closes. You owe me considerably more than a window. I intend to spend a long time being in your debt then. Something flickered through his eyes, that pale gray going warm at the edges like ice, finally agreeing to be water. Lucky for both of us, I no longer believe in collecting on those. Outside, the night had gone quiet in the particular way. Nights go quiet after something true has finally been said out loud in a room built to hold lies. Not silent, never silent, but settled, the way water settles after a stone stops disturbing it. Somewhere past the border, in Hollowmere, an old council was being dismantled name by name. Somewhere closer, a woman who had spent 11 years sitting on the truth about her son was finally allowed to grieve him in daylight. And in a hall that had once held a contract meant to spend a girl like coin, a king and the woman he'd refused to buy stood close enough to share breath and far enough to still be choosing it. Every second, on purpose. The debt of Hollowmere was never paid. It was torn. First the paper, then the lie underneath it, then the silence that had outlasted both. What was never for sale was her. What was finally true was that she'd been the one to say so, out loud, in a hall full of men who'd needed 3 years and a king's stubborn curiosity to hear it. She did not leave that hall as anyone's settlement. She left it as the only ledger entry of the night that no one, ever again, would be allowed to write without her own hand on the pen.